Sechus Megillah Daf Zayin begins with a discussion between Esther and the Chachamim as to whether or not the Yom Tov of Purim should be established for all generations. Gemara will also discuss whether or not Megillah Esther has Kedusha, whether it's considered to be a Sefer. The Gemara will speak about whether the Megillah was written with Ruach HaKodesh or was written without Ruach HaKodesh. The Gemara will then speak about other Svarim. Do they have Kedusha, and were they written with Ruach HaKodesh? The Gemara will then get into the halachos of Purim itself, how you give matanas le'evyonim, what is Mishlach Manas, and how the Sudas Purim should properly be observed. Then we'll get to two small Mishnayos which list other similar halachos and in what way they are different and in what way they are similar, and the Gemara will comment on each of them. So let's begin the Gemara. The Gemara says that Rav Shmuel Bar Yehuda says that Esther sent a message to the Chachamim after the Purim miracle had happened: establish me for generations, meaning make a Yom Tov out of this nace, so we should remember it. And the Chachamim initially refused, and they said, if we do that, then our surrounding neighbors, the nations around us, will hate us because we're celebrating their downfall. So she responded and she said, I'm already written up in the history books of Madai and Paras, therefore it's not going to get any worse if we make an observance out of it. The Gemara then says, similar discussion, some issue as to who said it. The Gemara has the group of Rav Chanina, Rav Yochanan, Rav Chaviva, and Rav. So the Gemara says, whenever you find these four, some people switch out Rav Yochanan for Rav Yonason. We've had this earlier in Shas as well. We had this in the beginning of Masechta Sukkah. So the Gemara says, but they said as follows. They said that Esther sent to the Chachamim Kasvuni L'Deiros. Write me down as a Megillah, write down the story in a Megillah, meaning make the Megillah into part of Tanakh. And the Chachamim sent back, we only write about a war against Amalek 3 times. You cannot have more than 3 discussions, references to our ongoing dispute with Amalek throughout Tanakh. And the reason for that is because there's a pasuk in Mishlei which says only 3 times. What's that? It says, Halekasafti l'cha shalishim. I wrote it 3 times, so 3 times. Now we already have it 3 times. It's twice in Chumash, and once in Nevi'im. In Chumash it's in Sefer Shemos at the end of Beshalach, and it's Parshas Zachar, which is in Devar. So those are 2, and the third one is in Sefer Shmuel, where Shaul goes to war against Amalek. So you cannot have an additional one. So the Gemara says they later found that there is a source that you could have an additional one, and that's from the pasuk in Dvarim, which talks about Vachamas Amalek, and it says Ksoiv Zois Zikaron Ba Sefer. So the Gemara says it was a machlokes Tanaim how to understand this pasuk Ksoiv Zois Zikaron Ba Sefer. It refers to 3 things. It says right Zois, Zikaron, and Ba Sefer. So what are the 3 things? So we initially thought, the way it was explained by Rabbi Yeshua, Zois refers to Shemais, where it's written in Beshalach. Zikaron refers to Devarim, and Basefer refers to Navi, and therefore there is no room for an additional writing in a Megillah. Gemara says, no, you can understand it differently. Zois could refer to Chumash, and therefore that includes both Shemais and Devarim. Zikaron refers to Navi, that refers to Shmuel, and Basefer, that's for Megillah. You could write it in Ksuvim, and therefore you could write a Megillah about it, and we do have a Megillah at this point, and that's the opinion of Rabbi Elazar Hamadoi. Okay, the Gemara goes further and says, does the Sefer of Esther have Kedusha or not? So if it's considered to have Kedusha, then it would have the halacha that is Metami Yadayim. The halacha is that any Sefer is Metami your hands. You have to wash your hands after you touch the Sefer before you eat. And the reason is because Chazal were concerned that people were storing their Truma, which has Kedusha, together with their Svarim, which have Kedusha. Since they both have Kedusha, they should be kept together. That way it'll be easier to observe the halachos of Kedusha. The problem was that the mice come to the Truma, and the mice will also eat your Svarim if they're inspecting your Truma along the way. Therefore, in order to prevent people from keeping Truma and Svarim together, they made a halacha that Svarim Sifri Kodesh are Matame. But that only refers to Svarim that were written with Ruach HaKodesh. So the Gemara says that Rav Yehuda says the name of Shmuel, Esther is not Matamis Yadayim, meaning it's not written with Ruach HaKodesh. Now the Gemara says, how could you say that? Shmuel, as we're going to quote later, Shmuel holds that Esther was written with Ruach HaKodesh. So the Gemara answers, no, what he means to say is as follows. Esther was said with Ruach HaKodesh, but it's not supposed to be written. Ruach HaKodesh is involved in the composition of the text, but to write it down into a sefer, that is not Ruach HaKodesh, did not say to do that, and therefore the sefer itself does not have Kedusha. Now the Gemara speaks about Sefer Koheles. The Gemara brings a brisa, that is, which speaks about Koheles and Shir Shirim, and this is going to end up being a kasha on Shmuel. So the brisa says as follows: it has three opinions as to what has Kedusha. Rabbi Meir says Koheles is metame your hands, and there's a machlokas between Beisel and Meshami about Shir Shirim. Rabbi Yossi says the opposite. Shir Shirim is metame the hands, there's machlokas between Beisel and Meshami about Koheles. Rabbi Shimon says Koheles is a machlokas between Beis Shammai and Beisel, and this is a case where Beis Shammai is more lenient and says it is not metame in the hands, and Beisel says more strictly that it is metame in the hands. Now the rest concludes, and it says Rus, Shir Shirim, and Megillah Esther are metame in the hands. So you see clearly that it is metame in the hands, and that's against Shmuel, so that it's not. So Gemara answers Shmuel will hold like Rabbi Yishua, which we saw earlier, who holds that K'soiv Zois Ikaron B'Sefer refers to Shemais B'Shalach, and Shmuel will not allow a additional Sefer to be written, and therefore he holds that Megillah Esther does not have Kedusha. Okay, now the Gemara discusses if Koheles has Kedusha or not. So Gemara brings a brisa. Rav Shimon ben Menashe says Koheles is not metame in the hands because all it is the wisdom of Shlomo HaMelech. It's not Ruach HaKodesh. It's Shlomo's wise sayings, which is very important, obviously, but it's not Ruach HaKodesh, and therefore it doesn't have Kedusha to be metame in the hands. So Gemara asks, but that can't be correct, because Shlomo said a lot more than Koheles, but Koheles is the only one that's written down. Therefore, the choosing of these to be written down must have been said with Ruach HaKodesh. It was Ruach HaKodesh which decided which ones to form the Sefer, and therefore it should have Kedusha. Now, how do we know that Shlomo said much more? So there's a pasuk in Malachim, which is after the writing of Koheles, where it says, Vayidaber Shloshis Alafim Mashal, that Shlomo HaMelech said 3,000 Mashalim, 3,000 parables. So, the 3,000 proverbs, that is. That is all besides for Koheles. So how did we choose Koheles from amongst them all? So the Gemara says, maybe you'll tell me that Shlomo chose whichever ones he wants to write. Okay, so then there's no Kedusha, there's no Ruach HaKodesh involved. And that can't be, because the pasuk says, Al Tosf Al Dvarav, don't add anything else onto the words. It means you cannot expand Koheles. It means it wasn't up to Shlomo, it was up to Ruach HaKodesh, which decided which ones go into Koheles and which ones don't. And therefore Koheles does have Kedusha, and therefore this opinion does not agree with Rav Shimon ben Menashe, and holds that Koheles does have Kedusha, and it is metame the hands. Alright, now the Gemara gets into the discussion of whether or not Esther was written with Ruach HaKodesh, Megillah Esther. The Gemara is going to bring up to 8 different proofs from the Megillah itself that Ruach HaKodesh was involved in the writing. We'll start with 5 from Tanaim and 1 from Shmuel. The Gemara will bring 2 more from Amoraim. So the 5 of Tanaim are as follows. First one, the Gemara says, is Rabbi Eliezer, who says, it says, Vayomer Haman Belibo. Haman responded to Achashverosh, what should you do for whom the king wishes to honor? Till he first thought in his heart, the king is referring to me. Now how would the writer of the Megillah, who's Esther, how would we know what Haman was thinking in his heart unless Ruach HaKodesh had said so? Second source is Rabbi Akiva. He says, because it says, Vati Esther noseis chen be'eini kol ro'eha. Esther found favor in the eyes of everyone who saw her. So how would we know what everyone was thinking? Again, Ruach HaKodesh. Rabbi Meir says, it's from where it says, Vayavad Hadav Mordechai. Mordechai found out about the plot to kill Achashverosh of Bigsan and Seresh. How would Mordechai find out? It must be Ruach HaKodesh said it to him, and therefore again Ruach HaKodesh is involved. Rabbi Yosef ben Damascus says the source is because it says, Babizil Shalchos Yadam, after the war, Klal Yisrael did not send their hands, they did not take any of the loot. How would we know what every single person far away from Shushan, what they did? That must be again Ruach HaKodesh. And these are the 5 sources of Tanaim. Now, the Gemara says that Shmuel says, if I would have been there by that discussion, I would have had a better source than all of them. Because it says, Kimu v'kiblu ha'yehudim. Kimu, they established, v'kiblu, and they accepted. That means that was established in Shemayim what they accepted here on earth. Klal Yisrael on earth accepted the mitzvah of Purim for all generations. And in Shemayim they established that, they made that actual halacha. So how would we know what was doing in Shemayim? It must again be Ruach HaKodesh was involved. Says the Gemara, all of the 5 of the Tanaim you can find the way out of. It's not a solid proof. Shmuel's is a solid proof. How do you find the way out of each of them? So the Gemara says the source, the first one which we said, Rabbi Eliezer, that Vayamar Haman Belibo, that's not such a proof. We know what Haman was thinking because Haman knew he was the most highest ranking person, and you can tell by what he said afterwards. Bring the source, the king, and all the horse and the clothing. That this was an honor that he desired for himself. And the next source was from the fact that Esther found favor in everyone's eyes. It could just be like we've seen other Tanaim say that everyone said that Esther was from their nation, and that's what's meant by found favor in their eyes. And they were speaking this out with their mouths. We knew what they were thinking because they said, "Oh, Esther is from one of us." As far as the third source, Mordechai found out about Bigsan and Seresh's plot. Again, that could be because they were Tarshiyim, and Mordechai understood the Tarshi language because he was from Sanhedrin. And as far as the next, Yossi ben Damascus, where it says, "Uva biza le'sholches yadam," so that could be that messengers were sent to the palace from all around Shushan, from all around the Medinos of Achashverosh, to say that we didn't take any of the booty, in order that Esther and Mordechai should relay that message to the king, and that the king should not be upset about them taking the loot that they looted. So Gemara says Shmuel's though has no refutation. Gemara says therefore you see one small sharp pepper is better than a basket full of melons because the pepper gives more flavor, it's sharper. Therefore Shmuel was just an Amora, gave us a better source than all the Tanaim. Gemara gives 2 more sources from Amoraim. Rabbi Yehuda says, because it says V'mei Purim me'ela lo yavru mitoch Yehudim. These days of Purim will never pass from amongst the Jews. How would we know the future? Must be Ruach HaKodesh. Menachem bar Yitzchak says V'zircham le'yosef mizaram, and their memory will not be ended from their descendants. Again, same thing. How would we know the future? Must be Ruach HaKodesh was involved. Okay, now the Gemara goes into the halacha of Matanos Levyonim and Mishloach Manos. So the Gemara says Mishloach Manos is you send plural Manos, 2 portions of food, but you send it ish l'reyu, 1 man to his friend. You only have to send it to 1 person. However, Matanos Levyonim is presents to paupers, and therefore you have to send at least 2 gifts, and it has to be to 2 paupers, so 1 to each should suffice. Now the Gemara gives an example of Matana of Mishloach Manos. According to different gears, so this is Matanos Levyonim. Actually, the Gemara says that Rav Yehuda Nasiya sent to Rav Oshia the thigh of a 3rd-born calf, which is the most flavorful, and a jug of wine. And he sent back and he said, "You have fulfilled the mitzvah of Mishloach Manos." According to our girsa, we removed the phrase Matanos Levyonim here because you've sent me 2 portions to 1 individual. Okay, more on these halachas. The Gemara describes other Mishloach Manos in that were sent. The Gemara says that Rabbah sent to Mari Bar Mar through Abai. Abai was the messenger. He sent a basket full of dates and a container of flour made from roasted grain. So Abai said when Mari receives this, he's going to say, you see, a farmer is always a farmer. And even if he becomes king, he still walks around with a basket of animal food around his neck to feed his animals. Meaning to say that Rabbah became the Rosh Hashiva in Pumbedisa, and he's in a very high-ranking position, but still he sends low-ranking foods, even though he has access to much better things now. So Rabbah therefore went, and he sent a cupful of peppers and a basket of ginger. So Abai said, okay, now when Mari receives this, he's going to say, I sent sweet things, and look, he sent me sharp things. Now, as an aside, the Gemara here mentions that Abai said that when I left Rabbah's house to deliver this Mishloach Manos, I was full, I wasn't hungry. But when I got to Mari, he brought me 60 plates of 60 different types of food, and I ate 60 pieces of them. So I ate a lot, and the last one was tzli kader. It was a pot roast, and it was so good, and I was so hungry afterwards still that I wanted to eat the plate. So Abai says, you see from this, one of 2 things. You see, either poor people don't know when they're hungry, they think they're full and they're not, or even if you're full, there's always room for something sweet. Now, the Mefarshim explained this is not meant to be taken literally. This was not Abai really eating this gluttonous amount. This was talking about the amount of Torah that he learned, and that he always had room for more, and he always wanted to learn more. Now, as far as the Suda of Purim, the Gemara discusses, the Gemara says that Abaye Bar Avin and Rav Chanina Bar Avin used to have Sudas Purim by each other, and they switched off. One year they went to one house, and the other year they went to a different house. Now, Rabba and Rabbi Zeira. So, first of all, Rava says that a person has to drink on Purim enough alcohol to become sweet meaning intoxicated, to the point that he doesn't know the difference between Or Haman and Baruch Mordechai. He can't tell the difference between cursed be Haman and blessed be Mordechai. On that note, Rabbi and Rav Zeri used to do Seudas Purim together, and one day they got drunk, and Rabbi got up and shachtei Rabbi Zeri. He slaughtered Rabbi Zeri. Mepharshim explained that this means either he injured him, or was not literal, or he just roundly won over him in an argument in learning. And anyway, when Rabbi saw what he had done, he was a mispalel. He davened for Rabbi Zeri, and he brought him back to life. The next year, he invited Rabbi Zeri again, and Rabbi Zeri said, "No, thank you. A miracle doesn't happen every time. I'm not going to rely on you bringing me back to life this time, and therefore I'm not going to join you for the Purim Suda." Says the Gemara further, put the Purim Suda has to be eaten during Purim day, not at night, not the night preceding Purim. And if somebody eats it at night, he's not fulfilled the halacha of Purim Suda, because it says Yemei Mishta v'Simcha, by day, not later. Gemara quotes an incident. Rav Ashi was sitting in front of Rav Kahana, and it was on Purim, and he was waiting for the Talmidei Chacham to come to the Beis Medrash to learn, and they weren't coming, they were late. So Rav Kahana asked Rav Ashi, where are they, why are they late? So they said, maybe they're busy with the Purim Suda, they didn't finish the Suda yet. So he said, well, why didn't they do it last night? He said, well, don't you hold, like Rava said, that if you eat the Purim Suda or not, you're not Yaitza. He said, oh, really, Rava said that? And he chazed it over, he reviewed it 40 times, until he had it like it was in his pocket. Okay, now we get to the Mishnah. So, our last Mishnah had discussed the difference between Adar Rishon and Adar Sheni, and said the only difference that exists. Our Gemara now is bringing a list of Mishnayos, very short ones, each one discussing a different pair of halachos, and identifying the only differences between them. So, our first Mishnah discusses Shabbos and Yom Tov. The Gemara says the halachos of Shabbos and Yom Tov, as far as malacha, are the same. The only difference is that you're allowed to cook for things you will eat on Yom Tov. You can't cook on Shabbos. So the Gemara says, now let's discuss what about machshirei ochel nefesh. What about preparing food which is not cooking? Like, for example, sharpening a knife so you could prepare the food. You're allowed to do that. So our Mishnah clearly holds you're not, because it doesn't say you're allowed to. The Gemara says that's one side of a machlokes. So you have a machlokes between Rabbi Yehuda and a Tanna Kama. Are you allowed to prepare, are you allowed to do a more distant, indirect preparations for your food or not? Rabbi Yehuda says you're allowed to, and the Chachamim say you're not. So our Mishnah clearly says you're not allowed to. So Gemara says, what's the reasoning behind this machlokes? So Rabbi Yehuda holds that it says, Hu levada yeyas lachem. It says lachem, you're allowed to do for you and all your needs. Anything which you need for Yom Tov food, you're allowed to do, even something that's indirect, like sharpening the knife. And the Chachamim say, no, it says, Hu levada yeyas lachem. This is what you're allowed to do. Only this specific thing, only the cooking of the food, not anything else, not anything more general. Now, what do they each do with each other's in pasuk? So Yehuda says, "Who is meant to exclude things which you could have done before Yom Tov that you didn't do. If you could have sharpened the knife before Yom Tov, you wouldn't be allowed to do that on Yom Tov. But other preparations you would be allowed to. If you couldn't do it before Yom Tov." And the Chachamim will say, "Lachem" is meant to include that you're only allowed to do things for use that are for yourself. You're not allowed to cook food for Ovdei Kechavim or for animals. Okay, next Mishnah. Next Mishnah discusses Shabbos and Yom Kippur. The Mishnah says the only difference between the halachas of Shabbos and Yom Kippur is one is kares, and one is punishment by the court here on earth. If somebody violates Shabbos, gets skila, punishment here on earth. If one violates Yom Kippur, gets kares. So Gemara says two sugyas. First of all, what about tashlumin, a different thing which appears to be a difference between them, and then a Mishnah which seems to will involve our Mishnah in a different machlokas. So first of all, the halacha of tashlumin. The halacha of tashlumin is as follows: if you damage somebody's things with the same activity that causes you to be liable to the death penalty, you don't have to pay. One action, such as you set fire to somebody's field on Shabbos or on Yom Kippur, so you get the death penalty. Or at least on Shabbos you get the death penalty. So therefore you don't have to pay. The same action cannot obligate you two punishments independently, and you don't have to pay for the damage that you caused. So Gemara says, does that apply to Yom Kippur or not? Yom Kippur you don't get the death penalty. Yom Kippur you get kares. Does that count? Is that also considered the death penalty as far as this halacha is concerned? So Gemara says, our Mishnah seems to indicate that it is, because it does not say that whether you pay or not is a difference between Yom Kippur and Shabbos. The only difference it says is whether you get kares or skila. So Gemara says that's coming down on one side of Machlokes between Rav Nachuni ben Akana and the Chachamim. Nechoni ben Akana says that's true. He agrees with our Mishnah, as our Mishnah probably is of Nechoni ben Akana, because he says that somebody who violates Yom Kippur at the same time that he causes damage does not need to pay. Chachamim disagree, and they will not fit with our Mishnah. Okay, now the Gemara quotes our Mishnah relative to a different discussion, a different machlokas. That is a discussion about what happens if somebody who's chayiv kares gets malchus instead. Most mitzvos, most averos, which include kares, also include malchus. So the Gemara considers it's possible that if you get the kares, then you don't have to. If you get the malchus, you get the whipping, you don't have to have the kares. That functions instead of the kares. Kares is a backup if you didn't get the malchus. The Gemara quotes a Mishnah that says this halacha, the name of Rabbi Chananya ben Gamliel. If you get the malchus, you don't get kares. So the Gemara says that Rabbi Yochanan said that there were others who argue on him. Most of them argue on him. The Gemara wants to say that our Mishnah argues on him. Why? Because our Mishnah says that the difference between Shabbos and Yom Kippur is that Shabbos has punishment in the hands of people, and Yom Kippur has a kares. Now, if you could just get malchus and avoid the kares, it's also punishment in the hand of people. That wouldn't be a way of defining the difference. Both of them have punishment in the hand of human beings. So Gemara says not necessarily. It could be that our Mishnah agrees that if you get malchus, you will take off your kares. But our Mishnah holds like Rabbi Nachman Yitzchak, who says that there is no malchus option for kares. If there would be, it would take off the kares. But this Mishnah happens to hold that there isn't one. There is such an opinion. Or possibly our Mishnah is only talking about the main punishment. The kares is the main punishment. The malchus could get you out of it. And therefore our Mishnah says the main punishment of Shabbos is human distributed, while the main punishment of Yom Kippur is kares. And that's the difference. We're not talking about the way you should get out of it by getting malchus instead.